Picture this, a perfectly still, glassy lake tucked away in the hills of ancient Italy. The Romans called it Diana's Mirror. It sounds beautiful, right? Serene. But hiding in the sacred grove right on its shore was a dark, violent secret, a recurring tragedy that has stumped historians for centuries. So, let's pull back the curtain on the story of the King of the Wood.
Now this priest was also a king, but this was no ordinary throne he sat on. You see, he was a murderer. He had to kill the guy before him to get the job, and he lived every single day in this state of constant, paranoid fear because he just knew, that someday another challenger was going to come along to do the exact same thing to him. The rule for getting this job was, well, it was as simple as it was brutal. You had to be a runaway slave. First, you break a branch from a very specific, sacred tree. Then, you challenge the current priest to a fight to the death. And you're the new king. It's a custom so bizarre it had no parallel anywhere in the classical world. It's like this jagged, ancient rock jutting out of a perfectly manicured lawn. And it presents one heck of an ancient mystery.
So our investigation really boils down to two key questions. First, why the murder? Why did you have to kill the guy before you? And second, what's the deal with the branch? Why did you have to pluck that golden bough before you could even start the fight? To get the answers, we have to look way beyond Italy and search for a much bigger, global pattern in how human belief works.
So, to solve this very specific, very local Italian mystery, we have to do something that seems a little counterintuitive. We have to zoom way out. Our first big clue isn't in how unique this ritual was, but in something that was actually surprisingly common.
Yeah, the whole kill to become king thing was a one-off. But the idea of a priest who is also a king? Turns out, that was everywhere. This combo of royal power and religious duty shows up again and again in early societies, and that suggests there's some kind of deep, fundamental connection between the right to rule and the sacred.
I mean, just look around the ancient world. You've got the sacrificial king in Rome, the deified pharaohs in Egypt, the Inca emperors who were seen as literal children of the sun. The pattern is crystal clear. Rulers weren't just politicians. They were often seen as the essential link to the gods, or, in some cases, something even more.
And this is where we get to the absolutely mind-bending concept of the man-god. This is the idea that a human being could literally be a god in the flesh, with the power to control the weather, make the crops grow, and basically guarantee that life goes on. But the million-dollar question is, how on earth could anyone actually believe this was possible?
Well, believing in a man-god makes a lot more sense if you see the world differently. It comes from a worldview where there's no hard line between the natural and the supernatural. It's a world run not by physics, but by a principle we now call sympathetic magic. Sympathetic magic is really humanity's first stab at figuring out cause and effect. And the core idea is incredibly simple and powerful. Like produces like. Basically, you can make something happen just by acting it out, by mimicking it.
And people got really specific with these rituals. If you wanted your rice stalks to grow long, women would plant the seeds with their hair hanging down their backs. See? Long hair, long rice. Want to hurt an enemy, you make a little doll of them and hurt that instead. This like produces like logic was everywhere.
Okay, so this leads to a pretty high-stakes situation. If your king is basically a god who's supposed to control the harvest and the weather through his own vitality, what happens when there's a drought? What does a divine performance review even look like?
And the answer is, it's brutal. If the king's magic failed, he could be insulted, beaten, maybe even kicked off the throne. But in really extreme cases, like with some old Swedish kings during a famine, the community would decide the problem was the king himself. And so, the divine ruler was sacrificed to appease the very gods he was supposed to be.
Okay, so we've got the idea of a sacred, divine king who could be killed if things went wrong. Now let's get back to Nemi and look at our second big clue, the priest's very specific title and where he lived.
Think about it. He wasn't the king of Rome or the king of Italy. He was the king of the wood. That title points us away from cities and politics and straight into the deep, primeval forests that used to cover Europe. It points to a profound, ancient belief in the power of trees.
You see, in the ancient mind, tree spirits weren't just quiet things living in the woods. Oh no. They were seen as these incredible, powerful forces of life and fertility. They could do everything a community needed to survive. Make it rain, make the crops grow, make sure the animals had babies, and that people did too. So, now we have our two main clues.
the risky life of the divine man-god, and the life-giving power of the tree spirit. Now, finally, we can put all the pieces of this puzzle together and solve the mystery of Nemi for good.
The last piece of evidence, the key that unlocks the whole thing, comes from these folk customs that survived across Europe for centuries. In these spring festivals and rituals, you see a repeating pattern. A living person, often called a May King or a Green George, gets dressed up in leaves and flowers to physically represent the spirit of vegetation.
And when you put the two side by side, it just clicks. At Nemi, you have the priest king and the sacred bough. In these folk traditions, you have the May King and the May tree. It's the exact same pattern, a double representation of the tree spirit, one in a person and one in a plant. This right here, this is our aha moment.
So the first part of our solution is now crystal clear. The king of the wood wasn't just some priest. He was understood to be the living, breathing, walking, talking incarnation of the spirit of that sacred grove.
And the Golden Bough. That wasn't just some random branch. It was seen as the physical home of the tree spirit's soul, its life force. So by plucking it, the challenger was literally taking possession of that life force, which gave him the right to fight for the whole package.
And that, finally, explains the murder. The community absolutely could not afford for its god of fertility, the spirit of vegetation, to get old and weak and die. So the priest had to be killed while he was still strong, so that the spirit could be immediately transferred to a new, younger, more vigorous body. It was a brutal ritual designed to guarantee the eternal life of the crops, the animals, and the people themselves.
So you might be wondering why this gruesome ancient ritual matters at all. Well, it's actually more than just a weird historical story. It represents a really fundamental stage in how humans think. At the end of the day, the king of the wood trying to control the rain and the harvest comes from the exact same human desire that drives a meteorologist or an agricultural scientist today. The methods have totally changed. We've swapped magic for science. But that fundamental goal of understanding and controlling our world, that's exactly the same.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If you can draw a straight line from the priest of Nemi to the modern scientist, what other ancient ways of thinking, what other echoes of magic might still be hiding in plain sight, shaping our modern lives in ways we don't even recognize?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into Sir James Frazer's classic work, The Golden Bough, to unpack a way of looking at the world that is, well, completely bizarre to us. But, as we're about to see, it has a strange and powerful logic all its own.
So just imagine this for a second. You're a powerful ruler, a king, maybe even seen as a god on earth. But you are absolutely forbidden from ever touching the ground. You have to be carried everywhere, because one wrong step and you could literally shatter the entire cosmic order. Now, this isn't some fairy tale. For many ancient leaders, this was their reality. You see, for these divine kings, having all that power came with a heavy price. It was a prison made of sacred rules, all designed to keep the universe itself running smoothly. And a perfect example of this is the Mikado of Japan. He wasn't just a ruler, he was believed to be a literal incarnation of the sun goddess. His body was seen as this cosmic linchpin, and his entire life was hemmed in by an incredible set of taboos.
I mean, the level of control here was just absolute. He couldn't feel the sun on his head or the earth under his feet. His hair and nails couldn't be cut, so attendants had to literally steal the clippings while he slept. And every single morning, he had to sit perfectly still on his throne for hours because it was believed his stillness alone maintained peace across the entire empire.
As you can imagine, the pressure of holding the world together just by sitting still was, well, immense. So eventually they found a pretty convenient workaround. They decided that the imperial crown was the real source of all that stability, so they could just place it on the throne instead, freeing the man from his daily duty. And this wasn't just a thing in Japan, not at all. We see this all over the world. In Africa, you had a king who had to sleep sitting up just to keep the winds blowing. In Rome, the high priest of Jupiter couldn't even have a single knot on his clothing. This burden of divine responsibility was a truly global phenomenon.
So this brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why all these bizarre, life-altering rules? Why would anyone, especially the most powerful people, agree to live like this? The answer, it turns out, lies in how they understood the very essence of life itself.
You see, all those taboos, all those strange rules, they were basically life preservers. But not for the body, for the soul. And to get this, we have to understand a concept of the soul that is totally different from ours.
To them, the soul wasn't some abstract idea. It was a physical, tangible, and very vulnerable object. The best way to think about it is like a little person living inside the big person. Death was simply when that little person left for good. Sleep, that's just when it decided to go for a little wander.
Frazer tells a story about a missionary trying to explain the concept of body and spirit, saying, "I am two in one," and an Aboriginal man supposedly replied in perfect agreement because he understood it in the most literal sense. It was just obvious to him.
So what was this soul thing made of? Well, beliefs varied. Sometimes it was a perfect little miniature of the person. Other times it took the form of an animal, a lizard, a butterfly, even a mouse. Some cultures even believed it had physical weight, and that its length determined your lifespan. A short soul meant a short life. Simple as that.
Okay, so if your soul is a physical object that can just up and leave, then your number one goal in life becomes pretty simple. Keep it in your body no matter what.
And they knew exactly when it was most vulnerable. The mouth and nose were basically open doors. Sleep was a nightly risk, with the soul out wandering who knows where. And a sudden shock? That could literally frighten the soul right out of you.
And the precautions they took were just as physical as the belief itself. I mean, in some places, they would literally fasten fishhooks to a sick person's nose and navel to try and snag the soul if it tried to escape. Others would physically hold a dying person's mouth and nostril shut, trying to trap the soul inside.
This meant everyday life became this minefield of spiritual danger. A simple yawn was a huge risk, an open invitation for your soul to fly out, or for a demon to get in. During childbirth, they'd seal every crack in the house to stop the baby's brand new, vulnerable soul from just flying away.
And you had to be incredibly careful around anyone who was asleep. The fear was that if you changed their appearance, maybe by painting their face as a prank, their wandering soul might not recognize its own body when it came back. It would get confused, leave forever, and that person would never wake up.
But it gets even more complicated. The danger wasn't just your soul getting out. It was that parts of your soul could actually exist outside your body, which made them incredibly vulnerable to attack.
Think about your shadow and your reflection. To us, they're just tricks of light. But to them, they were tangible, physical parts of you, like external souls. So if someone could harm your shadow, they could harm you. If a spirit in the water could grab your reflection, it was grabbing a piece of your life.
And this belief that your shadow is literally part of your soul, it led to a practice that Frazer calls a striking example of this logic, and it is absolutely horrifying.
The terrifying answer to making a building strong and stable forever, you anchor it with a human life force. You trap a person's soul shadow right in the foundation.
The way they did it was just chilling. A builder would secretly measure the shadow of some unsuspecting person walking by. Then they'd take that measurement and bury it in the foundation. The belief was that the person, now deprived of their shadow soul, would just wither away and die, and their trapped life force would magically strengthen the building forever.
And you see the exact same kind of logic with reflections. People were terrified of dark pools of water, fearing a creature could snatch their reflection soul. In fact, many believe the myth of Narcissus isn't really about vanity, it's a cautionary tale about this ancient fear. This is also why we still see the custom of covering mirrors in a house after a death. The fear was the ghost might carry off the reflection soul of one of the living.
So let's just step back for a second and look at the big picture here. What might seem like a random collection of bizarre fears is actually a complete and internally consistent way of seeing the world.
You see, none of this was random. Once you accept that one single premise, that the soul is a physical thing that can be lost, stolen, or harmed, everything else just clicks into place. The king's stillness, the fear of yawning, even that horrible foundation sacrifice, they all become perfectly logical strategies for preserving life in a world full of spiritual danger.
And this really makes you think, doesn't it? What are the unquestioned beliefs that govern our own lives today? The things we do or the things we avoid, without really even knowing why? It's a fascinating question to consider. What hidden logic a future anthropologist might uncover about us?
All right, let's dive right into a really unsettling idea, something that comes from Sir James Frazer's massive work, The Golden Bough. We're going to take a journey into a world that operates on a completely different logic than ours, and honestly, it might just change how you think about life, death, and renewal.
So let's start with the central question, the really provocative one. What if the survival of your entire world, I'm talking the seasons turning, the crops growing. What if all of that depended on you performing one single brutal act? It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, but for a lot of ancient societies, this was a very, very real dilemma. Now, to even begin to wrap our heads around this, we have to grasp a concept that feels totally alien to most of us today. And that's the idea that gods could die. Yeah. For our ancestors, eternity just wasn't a guarantee for anyone, so it seemed totally logical that their gods were mortal, just like them. There's this great story about the Greenlanders. When Christian missionaries first showed up and told them about a single god who was immortal, who never died, they were just blown away. Their response, "He must be a very great god indeed," tells you everything you need to know about their worldview. Their default setting was that, of course, gods have a lifespan. And this wasn't just some one-off thing. When a North American Indian was asked about the creator of the world, his answer was so matter-of-fact. The creator? Oh, he's been dead for ages. It was just a practical, common-sense view of how the universe worked. And here's the thing. This wasn't some abstract philosophical idea. It was literally carved into the landscape. Even the great Greek gods we think of as these immortal beings, Zeus, Dionysus, Apollo, they all had tombs that you could go and point to. It made their mortality real, tangible. Okay, so if you believe that even the big, powerful gods up in the sky can die, well, that leads to a pretty terrifying problem down on Earth, right? What about the god who's living right there among you, in human form, your king? Suddenly, his mortality becomes the source of immense, constant anxiety for everyone.
And the stakes here were just astronomically high. Early people believed their entire existence, the weather, the harvest, everything was tied directly to the physical health of their divine ruler. If the king was strong, the world was strong. If he got sick, the whole world could fall apart.
So, what do you do? If you're facing this existential threat, this ticking time bomb of your king's mortality, what's the solution? Well, from their point of view, the answer was perfectly logical. To us, though, it's just absolutely brutal. Now, it's really important to get this. In their minds, this wasn't murder. It was preservation. It was cosmic maintenance. The idea was you had to kill the king the second he started to show any sign of weakness. That way, you could capture his divine soul while it was still powerful and transfer it, undamaged, to a new, healthy successor. It was like hitting a reset button to keep the world from crashing.
And believe me, this wasn't just some abstract theory. This stuff actually happened. These examples just hammer home the insane pressure these rulers were under. They had to be perfect. Even losing a tooth could be a death sentence.
Okay, so you can probably guess that a system like this, well, it couldn't last forever, right? It's just too brutal. Over time, these customs started to change, to morph into something more symbolic. And that big shift starts with the idea of a substitute.
What you see here is this really clear evolution, a gradual softening of the original custom. The logic is still there, but the act itself slowly moves away from the literal death of the king and toward a more ritualized, symbolic sacrifice that, in their view, still got the job done. And I want to be super clear here. This wasn't just some weird party game. This was a deadly serious ritual. At the Saqqara festival in Babylon, a prisoner literally became the king. He got the robes, the power, even the concubines. And at the end of 5 days, he was executed as the king. He took the fall for the kingdom so the real king and the world could live on. This is where it gets really fascinating, because this idea of a substitute, of a symbolic death, is the direct ancestor of all those folk traditions we see across Europe. A lot of these customs are almost certainly the modern, cleaned-up versions of these incredibly ancient, brutal rites.
You see the connection, right? The logic is exactly the same. The king of the wood or the tree spirit in these folk traditions is just a more focused version of that old divine king. He doesn't represent the whole cosmos, but he embodies the life force of the plants and the crops.
And once you start looking for it, you see this pattern everywhere in Europe. Whether it's a play beheading of a guy covered in leaves or shooting a figure called the Wild Man, they're all acting out the exact same drama. You have to symbolically kill the old spirit of last year's growth to make room for the new one.
And it's not subtle either. The connection is right there, out in the open. In these rituals, getting rid of the effigy of death and welcoming summer are not two separate things. They're two halves of the exact same act, a necessary cycle of renewal.
Okay, so this is where things get really wild. We've arrived at the core, mind-bending paradox of this whole belief system. And it's this: the idea that death itself, the very thing you're trying to get rid of, is actually the ultimate source of life and fertility.
I mean, you can't get much clearer than that, right? This is a little song that children in Bohemia would sing during one of these rituals. It just spells out the entire philosophy. There's no gray area. Getting rid of the old is what brings in the new. It's a direct transaction.
So get this, the very thing that represents death was both feared and revered. You had to destroy it, but at the same time, its remains, the straw, the twigs, were seen as containing this incredibly potent, life-giving force. People would take bits of it and put it in their fields and barns to guarantee a fertile year.
And lest you think this was just some weird European thing, nope, you see this same fundamental pattern all over the world. From mock funerals for spring gods in Russia to the ritual drowning of fertility gods in India, it's the same core idea, death and renewal, all tied up together.
So when you take a step back, the journey we've just been on is pretty incredible, isn't it? We've traced how this deadly serious, ancient belief about transferring a divine soul through violence, slowly, over thousands of years, evolved into the folk games that children play.
And that really leaves us with one final huge question. This ancient, deeply human logic, this idea that new life requires a sacrifice, that something old has to be torn down for something new to be built. Where does that pattern of thinking still show up, maybe unconsciously, in our modern world? It's something to think about.
Ever wonder about one of humanity's oldest, most persistent stories? You know the one, the myth of the dying and rising god? Today, we're going to dig in and find out where this incredibly powerful idea really comes from.
So, where do these stories of gods dying and then coming back to life actually come from? What if these epic, grand myths aren't really about some distant divine beings at all, but about something way more fundamental, something a lot closer to home?
Well, the answer isn't up in the heavens. It's right here, in the soil. Turns out, these powerful stories are deeply, deeply rooted in the cycle of agriculture, the literal life, death, and rebirth of the harvest, year after year.
Okay, our journey is going to start in the ancient Near East, with a figure whose name you've probably heard before, Adonis.
So at first glance, it's a classic tragedy, right? His name, Adon, it just means Lord. He's this beautiful young man, loved by the goddess Aphrodite, who gets tragically killed by a wild boar. But check out that last detail. Red anemone flowers were said to spring from his blood. The land itself is part of his story, directly linking his death to new life. That's a huge clue.
And this wasn't just a story they told, they lived it, reenacting it every single year. Women would lead these intense wailing ceremonies, carrying effigies of a dead Adonis, and then cast them into the sea. But here's the thing, the grief was always super short-lived. In a lot of places, they'd be celebrating his resurrection the very next day. This super fast cycle of death and revival, that's our first major clue.
All right, to really get what's happening next, we need to wrap our heads around this key concept, sympathetic magic. It's basically the idea that you can influence a big outcome, like say a successful harvest, by imitating it on a small scale. It's the logic engine that's powering all of these ancient rituals. And the gardens of Adonis are a perfect example of this in action. See, these weren't actual gardens. They were little pots of plants that grew really fast and died really fast. Their entire compressed life cycle was a ritual performance. By acting out this rapid growth and then tossing these gardens into water, people believed they were magically encouraging their real crops to grow and summoning that all-important rain.
Now, this pattern isn't a one-off thing with Adonis. If we head over to ancient Phrygia, we find a god named Attis, and his story and rituals, well, they echo Adonis's with some pretty startling precision.
I mean, just look at the parallels here. It's practically a template. Both are from the same general part of the world, both are loved by a great goddess, both are killed violently. And in both stories, new life, flowers, in this case, springs right from their blood. They are both, at their core, vegetation spirits whose deaths literally bring forth life from the earth.
And the rituals for Attis were, if anything, even more dramatic. It started by cutting down a pine tree, that was Attis, and bringing it into the sanctuary. Then came days of mourning and fasting, which climaxed on the Day of Blood, where the high priest, who was also called Attis, would literally draw his own blood, enacting the god's sacrifice. But then, all that intense sorrow was just wiped away by the Hilaria, this wild, joyful festival celebrating his resurrection.
Okay, let's travel over to Egypt now, where we find what is maybe the most famous example of the dying god in the entire ancient world, Osiris.
His story is just brutal. I mean, Osiris is the very god who taught humanity how to farm, how to grow wheat and barley. And he gets betrayed by his brother Set, sealed in a chest, and tossed into the Nile. His body is eventually found, only to be chopped into 14 pieces and scattered all over Egypt. But even through all that horror, his core identity is locked in with farming and that life-giving river.
And this right here is the smoking gun. You've got ancient temple reliefs that literally show corn stalks sprouting from the dead body of Osiris while a priest waters him. You cannot get a more direct link between a god and the grain than that. The inscription even calls him Osiris of the Mysteries, who springs from the returning waters. He is the corn.
Now, some people have tried to connect Osiris to the sun, but the details don't really fit. You know, the sun isn't torn into pieces. But the number 14, that points to a completely different cycle up in the sky. It perfectly matches the 14 days of the waning moon before it disappears and is renewed. It's a pattern of death and return that fits the myth like a glove.
So here's the really wild part. This incredibly powerful pattern of belief, it didn't just pack up and disappear when these ancient empires fell.
Nope. Instead, the very essence of these myths just moved. They survived for centuries, hiding in plain sight, right in the middle of European fields.
Let's jump forward in time and see how the spirit of Osiris, or the Greek goddess Demeter, was still alive and well in the harvest traditions of Europe, almost right up to our own time.
The continuity here is just mind-blowing. In ancient Greece, you have Demeter, the barley mother, mourning her lost daughter, who basically is the grain. Fast forward centuries, and in folk Europe, what do? They take the very last sheaf of the harvest and make it into a female doll called the corn mother. They drench this doll with water to bring rain and save its grains to ensure next year's crop would be fertile. It's the exact same goals, using the exact same kind of magic, just separated by thousands of years.
But remember, the harvest cycle isn't all sunshine and life and birth. It is also, by necessity, about death.
And just like those ancient gods died these violent deaths, these European folk customs had their own version of a ritual killing of the corn spirit. The guy who cut the last sheaf, often called the old man, would be playfully beaten or tied up in straw. Strangers passing by might get grabbed and symbolically threshed. It all sounds like harmless harvest games, but it was so much more. It was a ritual drama, acting out the necessary death of the spirit to guarantee its rebirth next season.
So, what does this incredible continuity, this straight line from an ancient god in a temple to a game in a harvest field, tell us about how our religious ideas actually develop over time?
Well, the evidence suggests this really fascinating progression. It seems to start with this very simple belief in a spirit that lives inside the plant. The corn is the divine thing. But over a long time, that spirit gets externalized. It gets made to look and act human. It gets anthropomorphized. And it slowly evolves into a powerful god or goddess who controls the corn from the outside.
So when you boil it all down, it suggests that our most profound, most powerful stories, these big ideas about sacrifice, death, and resurrection, they may not have started as abstract philosophical concepts at all. They seem to be rooted in something much simpler, much more basic. The desperate, universal, yearly need to make sure the grain would grow again.
And all this kind of leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? What parts of our own modern lives, what traditions do we still practice completely unaware that their ancient roots are right here, deep in the soil? All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really wild, a strange and violent ritual from ancient Italy. We're talking about a sacred branch, a fight to the death, and a priest king who had to be a murderer just to get the job.
So, let's set the scene, okay? Picture this. We're in a sacred grove at Italy's Lake Nemi. The guy in charge is called the King of the Wood. And get this, he's a priest, a king, and a murderer. Yeah, he got his title by killing the last guy, and he spends every single day knowing someone's gonna come along and do the exact same thing to him. But here's the twist. Before anyone can even challenge him, they have to pluck this special golden branch from a tree. So what's with the branch? That one kind of bizarre detail? Well, it turns out it's the key to unlocking a whole world of forgotten beliefs.
Okay, so to really wrap our heads around this, we need to break down the very specific and very deadly rules of the game.
So yeah, this was no free-for-all. It was a strict step-by-step process. First, the challenger had to be a runaway slave. Then he had to find and snap off this one specific branch. And only then, after all that, could he actually fight the king. Right away, that tells you something, doesn't it?
This isn't just about a brawl, it's a deeply symbolic ritual.
So you gotta ask, why? Why this whole elaborate, deadly setup? Well, it's because this king wasn't just some guy on a throne. His people believed his physical health was literally, mystically, tied to the health of the land itself. You know, if he was strong, the harvest was good. If he started to get weak or old, the land would fail. His life was the life of the community. And that explains the grim logic, right? He had to be killed while he was still in his prime to make sure his powerful life force could be passed on, undiminished, to a new, strong successor.
Okay, so how do we connect a divine king to this mysterious golden branch? Well, our first big clue lies in a really common ancient belief about just how dangerous sacred power could be.
The basic idea was this: a person filled with divine energy, a king, a priest, was kind of like a live electrical wire. Seriously. Their power could get contaminated if they touched the normal world, or worse, it could leak out and cause all sorts of damage. So what do? You create this whole complex system of taboos to keep them insulated, often literally suspended somewhere between heaven and earth.
And they took this idea to some pretty incredible extremes. I mean, the Mikado of Japan had to be carried everywhere just so he wouldn't touch the ground. But believe it or not, the same logic was often applied even more intensely to girls going through puberty. They were seen as being so charged up with this volatile, sacred energy that in some cultures, they were literally locked away for years, not allowed to touch the earth or see the sun. It was all about protecting both them and their community from this raw power.
And look, this wasn't just some obscure superstition people whispered about. The Roman scholar Pliny the Elder wrote about this stuff as if it were accepted scientific fact. This really deep, primal fear of certain natural forces was everywhere. People truly believed they had tangible power to ruin crops, mess up a hunt, or cause magical harm. And this idea of powerful, kind of dangerous substances, it's a huge piece of our puzzle.
All right, our next clue takes us on a bit of a journey, away from the taboos of ancient Italy and up to the great myths and fire festivals of Northern Europe.
Let's look at the Norse myth of Balder the Beautiful. When you really read it, it feels less like a fairy tale and more like a script for a ritual. So you've got this god Balder, who's basically invincible. Everything on Earth has sworn an oath not to hurt him. But there's a loophole. His mom completely overlooked the mistletoe, which, if you think about it, doesn't grow on the earth, it grows between heaven and earth, on the branch of a tree. And of course, the trickster god Loki spots this loophole, exploits it, and boom, the unkillable god is killed.
Now, that myth connects directly to these ancient European fire festivals. All across the continent, you had these pre-Christian rituals that marked the seasons with a giant bonfire, and usually the burning of some kind of effigy. In some places, like at Beltane in Scotland, they'd even choose a person by drawing lots for a symbolic sacrifice, which is a pretty chilling hint of a time when it was probably very, very real. This was all a form of what's called sympathetic magic, the idea that what you do to an object can influence the real world. So burning an effigy was supposed to renew the sun's fire and guaranteed the land's fertility.
And yeah, these rituals weren't always just symbolic. Roman accounts tell us about the Celts burning people alive inside giant wicker men. And even as late as the 18th century, people in Paris were burning baskets of live cats for good luck. Real sacrifice was just a grim, accepted part of this worldview. The goal was always renewal, and the cost, well, it was considered necessary.
Okay, let's take stock. We have a sacred king, this principle of insulation, and a myth about a god killed by mistletoe. Now it's time for the master key that pulls it all together. A strange but incredibly powerful belief about where you actually keep your soul.
The logic, and it's going to sound strange to us, is actually pretty simple. Your body is vulnerable, right? It can get hurt, it can get sick. So for the ultimate in safety, why not just put your soul, your life force, somewhere else for safekeeping? You can think of it like a spiritual safety deposit box. As long as that object is safe, you are basically invincible.
And this wasn't just some quirky local idea. No way. It's a truly global theme. You see it in Slavic folklore, where the villain Koshi the Deathless hides his soul in this crazy nesting doll chain of objects. You see it in ancient Egypt, where a man's soul is hidden in an acacia flower. In story after story, the hero's real quest isn't to fight the bad guy head-on, but to find and destroy the hidden object that contains their life.
So let's put all the pieces on the table. We've got a sacred king who's tied to nature. We've got the principle of insulation, keeping things suspended between heaven and earth. We've got the myth of a god killed by mistletoe. And we have this global belief in an external soul. With all that, we can finally go back to that sacred grove at Nemi and solve this murder mystery.
Okay, first thing you have to understand is that the King of the Wood wasn't just some guy guarding a tree. In a very real sense, he was the tree. He was the human embodiment of the oak spirit, which for many ancient European peoples was the most sacred tree of all.
Now, try to put yourself in the mindset of someone from the ancient world. It's the middle of winter. The giant oak tree looks totally dead, right? Just bare branches. But then, way up high on one of those branches, there's a clump of mistletoe, totally vibrant and green. It's not a huge leap to think, aha, the life of the oak, its very soul, must have retreated into that special plant for safety. And look where it is, suspended perfectly between the dead earth below and the cold sky above. And that's the big reveal. The legendary Golden Bough wasn't some made-up fantasy thing. It was the mistletoe, which, by the way, can look kind of golden when it catches the winter sun just right. It was seen as a real, tangible piece of the sun's fire, the external soul of the oak god.
And just like that, the whole ritual at Nemi suddenly makes perfect logical sense. The king was the oak spirit. His soul was stored outside his body, in the mistletoe growing on that very oak. And just like the god Balder, that made him pretty much invincible. So to kill him, a challenger had to make him mortal first. He had to pluck the golden bough, literally seize his external soul, and only then could this man who was also a god finally be killed.
So, what started out seeming like just a bizarre, savage rule turns out to have this incredible internal logic. It connects these deep beliefs about sacred kings, the cycle of the seasons, and the nature of the soul itself. And that leaves us with one last question to chew on. If this much meaning was hiding behind just one single forgotten ritual, what other ancient logic is still lying there just beneath the surface of our own modern world?